The sun was dipping low behind the trees when the man drove his old pickup down the familiar dirt road that led to his private lake. The sky glowing orange and purple. The cool breeze carrying the smell of pine and water. For years this road had been his escape. The place where his worries faded as soon as he reached the open shore. He knew every bump of the road, every curve where the grass grew tall, every shadow cast by the leaning oaks. But that evening something new appeared at the end of the path, something that made him slam his brakes and grip the steering wheel tighter. Standing across the road was a tall steel fence, its black metal bars stretching wide, cutting across the land like a scar. At the center of the fence stood a shiny gate, freshly painted, its surface glinting in the fading sunlight, and hanging on that gate was a heavy silver lock, thick and polished, as if daring anyone to try to open it. The man blinked, his chest tightening, his eyes scanning the barrier. For a moment he thought he had taken the wrong road, but no, this was his land, his lake, the only road that led to the water, the path he had walked since childhood, now blocked by steel and arrogance. He stepped out of the truck slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. The evening air suddenly colder. He walked closer to the fence, his fingers brushing the cold bars, his heart pounding with disbelief. Behind the fence the lake stretched out, calm and glistening under the twilight. The very sight of it made his chest ache. His lake, his property, now trapped behind a wall he never built. Voices stirred behind him. He turned and saw neighbors gathered in small groups, some whispering, some shaking their heads, their eyes full of unease. A woman clutched her grocery bag tighter, muttering that she had come to take her kids fishing but was told she wasn't allowed. An old man shook his head, saying he had lived there 30 years and had never seen anything like this. Their voices blended into a nervous hum, confusion and anger mixing in the air, and then, cutting through the noise, came a loud, smug voice. The HOA president himself stood near the corner of the fence, his hands tucked into his expensive jacket, his chin raised high, his smile sharp. He looked at the crowd like a king showing off his new castle. "Access is restricted now," he declared, his tone dripping with arrogance. "This lake is under the protection of the association. Only approved members will be allowed through." His words carried no shame, only pride. The neighbors muttered louder, some demanding to know who gave him the right, others too afraid to speak. The man's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. He stepped forward, his voice sharp as he asked what the president thought he was doing. He reminded him firmly that the lake was his, that the land belonged to him, that no one had the authority to put up a fence without his permission. The president smirked, tilting his head. Like a teacher correcting a child. "Paperwork doesn't matter anymore," he sneered. "Rules do, and the rules say no one comes in without our approval." His eyes narrowed, his smile spreading as though he enjoyed the outrage burning in the man's face. The man's chest rose and fell, his pulse thundering. He turned his eyes back to the lake behind the bars, the place he had worked for, the place he had poured his money and sweat into. And now he was being told he couldn't enter, that even he, the owner, had been locked out. The realization hit him like a stone. The fence wasn't just steel, it was a challenge, a declaration of war from the HOA. Neighbors shifted nervously, waiting for him to argue, waiting for someone to stand up to the president. The man took a step back, his eyes narrowing, his silence heavy. He wasn't the kind to explode in front of a crowd, but inside his chest the fire was already lit. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because if they thought a fence and a lock could keep him from his own lake, they had no idea what kind of storm they had just started. The night after the fence appeared, the man sat on his porch staring at the dark outline of the trees beyond which his lake lay hidden. The quiet of the evening broken only by crickets and the faint rustle of leaves. But his mind was loud, his thoughts racing with anger and disbelief, his fists clenched around the arm of the chair. He replayed the president's smug words again and again. "Paperwork doesn't matter, rules do." The arrogance burned into him. His lake, his land, fenced off as if he were nothing but a stranger trespassing on his own property. Sleep never came that night, only the fire of resolve. By morning he was ready to confront the board face to face, ready to hear their lies and throw the truth back at them. He put on his old jacket, tucked the deed to his property under his arm, and marched down the street toward the small HOA building. The neighbors watched from porches and windows, some nodding in quiet support, others looking away, afraid of the board's wrath. The building itself was nothing grand, just a small office at the end of the subdivision. But it stood like a fortress of arrogance, The man pushed the door open hard, the sound echoing off the walls. The board members sat around a long table, their papers stacked neatly, their coffee cups steaming, and at the head sat the president, his smug smile already in place as though he had been waiting for this moment. "Ah, here he is," the president said smoothly, "our concerned landowner." His tone mocked. The other members chuckled softly, their eyes gleaming with false confidence. The man stepped forward, slamming the deed onto the table so hard the cups rattled, his voice sharp and steady. "This is my land, this is my lake, and you had no right to block me from it." The room went silent for a moment. The president's smile faltered before curling back wider. He picked up the paper lazily, glancing at it as though it were meaningless, then set it back down. "Ownership means nothing without order," he said calmly. "And the HOA brings order. Your land may have your name, but the access is ours to control now. The community voted, and you are outnumbered." The man's chest rose sharply, his eyes blazing. He leaned over the table, his voice louder now. "You can't vote away my rights. You can't steal my property with rules you make up." His words echoed. The other board members shifted uneasily, but the president only leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We didn't steal, we improved," he said smugly. "We put up the fence to keep out troublemakers, to protect the value of our homes, and if you want access, you'll have to follow the rules like everyone else, pay the fees, sign the agreement, accept our control." The room filled with murmurs, some members whispering nervously. The man's fists slammed the table again, making the pens jump, his voice cutting sharp. "I will never pay you to use what already belongs to me. I will never bow to rules written by greedy hands." His words silenced the whispers. The president's eyes narrowed, his smile fading into a cold smirk. "Then you will stay locked out," he said softly, his tone like a knife. The man stared at him, his jaw tight, his silence heavier than words. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The neighbors outside jumped at the sound, watching as he marched past, his face set, his steps heavy. The confrontation had ended with no victory, but the fire inside him now burned hotter, stronger. He knew they had shown their hand. They had revealed their greed, and he would not let it stand. As he walked back toward his home, past the shadows of the fence that cut him from his lake, he whispered to himself, a promise sharp as steel, "This is not over." The days after the heated confrontation were uneasy ones. The neighborhood no longer felt like a peaceful community but like a stage where sides were being chosen. The man walked the streets each morning, his eyes catching every whisper, every quick glance from a porch or behind a curtain. Some neighbors greeted him with firm nods and quiet words of support, while others turned their backs, pretending not to see him. The fence by the lake had become more than metal bars. It was a line cutting through the entire community, splitting it in two, one side with the HOA and one side with him. A few evenings later, the man stood outside his truck and watched families gathering near the corner store, their voices sharp as they debated. An older fisherman, his face lined with years of sun, shouted that the HOA had no right to block a man from his own lake, his voice carrying across the lot. "I've seen him out there fixing the dock with his own hands. I've seen him clear the weeds. It's his, not theirs," he insisted. Others nodded, their faces tense. But across from him a younger couple shook their heads nervously, whispering that they couldn't afford to fight the board, that fines would destroy them, their voices low with fear. "It's better to stay quiet," the wife said softly, clutching her husband's arm. The divide spread like cracks in glass. Even children noticed, some asking their parents why they couldn't swim in the lake anymore, others repeating what they overheard about rules and ownership. The man felt the weight of every glance, every whisper, and though some gave him strength, others reminded him of the power the HOA held. One afternoon he found a note tucked under his door, written in careful handwriting. It said, "We stand with you, don't give up," no name signed, only courage hidden in ink. But the very next day he found another letter. This one from the HOA, cold and sharp, threatening that further disturbances or unauthorized entry attempts would bring heavy fines. The paper crumpled in his fist as he read it, the arrogance of their words burning his chest. The neighbors were now forced to choose between fear and truth, between standing with him or bowing to the board. One evening a group gathered near the fence, half shouting at the guards to let them in, half shouting at the others to leave before fines were issued. The arguments grew louder, people pointing fingers, friendships breaking, all because of a gate that did not belong to The HOA in the first place. The man stood back, watching the chaos unfold, his jaw tight, his silence heavy. He realized then that this was more than about him and his lake. This was about control, about fear, about a group of people who thought rules could erase ownership and dignity. The divide was painful, neighbors against neighbors. But within that divide he saw something else, a spark, a quiet strength in those who dared to whisper support. A strength he knew he could build on. Because if the HOA thought he would stand alone, they were wrong. He might not have all the neighbors on his side, but the ones he did have were enough to show him he wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by fear, and that realization hardened his resolve. He looked at the fence once more as the guards closed the gate for the night, the lock gleaming in the fading light, and he whispered under his breath, "Your time is coming." The morning sun rose bright over the rooftops, but for the man it brought no warmth, only the sting of anger as he walked once more toward the fence that now scarred the road to his lake. The dew on the grass sparkled like silver, but his eyes were fixed only on the tall black bars ahead. The gate stood shut, the lock gleaming like it was laughing at him. The sound of birds was broken by the heavy crunch of boots. 2 guards stood on the inside, their arms crossed, their eyes hidden by dark glasses, their faces blank but firm. The man slowed his steps, his fists tight. He carried a fishing pole in one hand, an old tackle box in the other. His plan was simple. He just wanted to fish in his own lake, nothing more. But as soon as he neared the gate, the guards straightened, their voices sharp. "You can't come in here," one said firmly, his tone cold and practiced. The man lifted the papers he carried, the deed with his name, shaking it in the air. "This is my land," he snapped. "That water belongs to me." The guard didn't flinch, didn't blink, only repeated the words drilled into him. "This lake is under HOA control. You step past this gate and you're trespassing." The man's jaw clenched, his pulse pounding, his eyes burning as he stared past them at the water glistening under the rising sun. So close yet so far. Behind him, a few neighbors gathered quietly, watching from a distance, their whispers sharp, some encouraging, some warning him to walk away. "They'll fine you. They'll sue you," one muttered. "Don't give them an excuse," another whispered. But the man stood his ground, his voice louder now. "You can't block me from what's mine." The guard stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt as though daring him to push further. "The rules say otherwise," he growled. "Go home before this gets worse." The man's chest heaved, his fishing pole trembling in his grip. He wanted nothing more than to smash the lock, to rip the fence apart with his bare hands. But he saw the cameras glinting in the trees, small red lights blinking, recording every move. The HOA had turned his lake into a prison, and he was the prisoner locked outside. The neighbors shifted nervously. One old man shouted, "Let him in, it's his land." But the guards silenced him with a glare. The man slowly lowered his pole, his voice low but sharp. "You can build your walls, you can hire your guards, you can put up cameras, but you can't erase the truth. This lake is mine and I will take it back." His words carried in the morning air, stronger than the guards expected. The crowd stirred, some clapping softly, others gasping. The guards looked unsettled for a moment but quickly turned back to their cold stance. "Not today," one muttered. The man turned slowly, his steps heavy as he walked back toward his truck, his chest burning with rage but also with a new kind of fire, because now he knew just how far the HOA was willing to go. They weren't just blocking him, they were watching him, recording him, trying to push him into a mistake. But he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. He tightened his grip on the papers in his hand, the deed that proved the truth, and he swore silently that he would find another way, a smarter way, and when he returned, it wouldn't be with a fishing pole, it would be with something they could never block, something that would turn their own arrogance against them. The lake shimmered behind the bars as he walked away, a reminder of what was his and a promise of the storm that was coming. The night after the confrontation with the guards, the man sat alone at his kitchen table, the only light coming from a small lamp that cast long shadows across the room. Papers were spread out in front of him, the deed to his land, old maps he had pulled from storage, letters from when he first bought the property years ago. His coffee sat untouched, gone cold. His eyes burned from hours of staring, but his determination kept him awake. The sound of the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, each second reminding him that the HOA had stolen another moment of peace from him. He ran his hand through his hair, muttering under his breath, "There has to be something." He had fought them face to face and been mocked. He had tried to reason with neighbors and seen them divided. He had tried to walk to his lake and been blocked by guards and cameras. Now he knew the only way forward was through the truth hidden in records, in the details the HOA had overlooked. He drove the next morning to the county office. The old building stood at the edge of town, its walls lined with shelves and drawers that seemed to hold the history of every inch of land in the area. The clerk behind the desk looked up in surprise as he walked in, carrying his folder under his arm, his eyes sharp with purpose. "I need every record you have on the parcels near Clearwater Lake," he said firmly. His voice heavy with urgency. The clerk hesitated but eventually led him to the public archive room. Rows of dusty folders and maps stacked in drawers. The air smelled of paper and old ink. He sat down at a wooden desk, spreading maps across the surface, tracing the lines of property boundaries with his finger. Hours passed as he flipped through deeds, tax records, survey notes. Most of it repeated what he already knew, that the lake itself and the land surrounding it was his name clear on the paperwork. But then, buried in the corner of an old folder, he found something strange. A parcel marked on the map right at the narrow strip of land where the road met the lake. The same strip where the HOA had built their fence and gate. His eyes narrowed. He pulled the deed for that parcel. The paper yellowed, the ink fading but still clear enough to read. And there it was, the name of an owner long gone, the taxes unpaid for years. The land officially still in the county's hands. Unclaimed, unsold, forgotten. His heart raced. He whispered to himself, "They don't own it. No one does." The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. The HOA had built their gate on land that wasn't theirs. They had no legal right to it. They had no claim. All their arrogance rested on stolen ground. He sat back in the chair, his chest rising and falling, his hands trembling slightly, a slow smile spreading across his face. Because now he had something stronger than anger. He had a weapon of truth. He gathered the papers carefully, tucking them into his folder, his mind already working fast. If the land was still owned by the county, that meant it was available. That meant anyone could buy it. And if he moved quickly, if he signed the right papers before the HOA even realized that someone could be him, the very land where their precious fence stood could become his. Not just the lake behind it but the gate itself. He walked out of the county office with a new fire in his eyes. The sun brighter, the air sharper, because he had discovered the crack in their armor, the hidden truth buried in dusty records. The HOA thought they had locked him out. But soon he would turn their own lock into his key, and when that day came, they would regret ever thinking they could control him. The man didn't waste time after discovering the forgotten parcel. His steps were fast as he left the county office, his mind racing with a plan that felt almost too good to be true. The autumn wind brushed against his face as he walked back to his truck, but he barely felt it. The papers in his hand burned hotter than fire, his fingers tight around the folder that held the crack in the HOA's wall of arrogance. He climbed into his truck, his heartbeat heavy, his lips curling into a grim smile. They built their fence on land that isn't even theirs, he muttered, the thought itself filling him with a deep satisfaction. For days the HOA had mocked him, shut him out, humiliated him in front of neighbors, but now he held the upper hand and they didn't even know it. That night he spread the records across his kitchen table again, the lamp glowing over the yellowed paper, the parcel number circled in thick red ink, the map showing clearly where the narrow strip touched the lake, exactly where their shiny new gate stood. It was county property, overlooked, ignored, waiting for someone bold enough to claim it. He barely slept, his excitement and focus keeping him awake. By dawn he was back at the county office, his jacket zipped tight against the cold morning air. The clerk blinked in surprise seeing him again so soon. "Back already?" she asked, and he simply nodded, his voice steady but sharp. "I want to file for purchase of parcel 8B. The clerk frowned, pulling the file, checking the records, her eyebrows raised. "This one hasn't been claimed in years, taxes unpaid, technically it belongs to the county." He leaned forward, his eyes firm. "Then I want it. Today." The paperwork began, page after page, signatures in black ink. His hand steady as he signed his name over and over, each stroke of the pen a nail in the coffin of the HOA's arrogance. The clerk processed the payment, stamping the forms, the heavy thump of the seal marking the end of years of neglect and the beginning of his quiet revenge. When it was done, she slid the final paper across the desk. "Congratulations, sir, it's yours now." Her words were simple but they felt like thunder in his chest. He held the deed in his hands, fresh and official, his name now tied forever to the strip of land where the gate stood. The gate that once mocked him now belonged to him. He walked out of the office with the document tucked safely under his arm. The morning sun brighter than before, his steps lighter, his chest stronger. But his mind already planning. He couldn't reveal this yet. He needed to keep it hidden, let the HOA continue their games. Let them laugh and boast at meetings, let them fine neighbors and strut like kings. All the while not knowing the ground under their proud fence no longer belonged to them, but to him, in secret. He drove past the fence that afternoon, slowing as he looked at it closely. The guards stood at attention, the lock gleamed, the cameras blinked. The president's car parked smugly nearby. The man's lips curled in a subtle smile. None of them knew that the bars they leaned against, the gate they locked so proudly, the soil beneath their feet, all of it now carried his name, his right, his power. He whispered under his breath, "Enjoy it while you can," and drove on, because soon he would reveal the truth, and when he did, the HOA that thought they had trapped him would find themselves trapped instead, begging at the very gate they built. The secret purchase was complete, the storm was coming, and he alone held the key. The HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the small community hall at the center of the neighborhood. The building was plain with brick walls and dusty windows, but inside it always carried an air of false importance. Rows of chairs were lined neatly. The boards sat at a long table in the front, their papers stacked high, their smug expressions polished like armor. Neighbors shuffled in, some curious, some nervous, others simply wanting to hear the next ridiculous rule the HOA would throw at them. But this meeting was different. The tension was heavy even before it began. Whispers filled the air. People talking about the fence, about the guards, about how the lake had become more a battlefield than a peaceful retreat. The man walked in slowly, his shoulders straight, his steps steady, his face unreadable. Under his arm he carried a slim folder, nothing grand, nothing flashy. But inside it was the weapon that would break everything. Some neighbors nodded at him with quiet respect. Others turned away nervously, afraid to be seen on his side. The president noticed him enter and smirked, leaning back in his chair, whispering something to the board members that made them chuckle. The meeting began with the usual words, the president tapping his pen against the table, boasting about how the fence had increased security, how property values would rise, and how troublemakers had been kept out. His words sharp, arrogant, full of false pride. The neighbors shifted, some clapping politely, others muttering angrily. The man stayed silent, waiting, his eyes steady, his hand resting on the folder. The president continued, his voice louder now, almost theatrical. "We have protected this lake better than ever before. The gate ensures that only members approved by us can enjoy its beauty, no one else, no exceptions." He leaned back with a satisfied grin, as if expecting applause, but the man stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. The president raised an eyebrow. "Do you have something to say?" he asked smugly, his tone mocking. The man walked slowly to the front, his boots heavy on the floor. He placed the folder gently on the table, his voice calm but sharp. "Yes, I do. You have locked me out of my own lake, mocked me, threatened me, and humiliated me in front of this community. But tonight I am here to return the favor." Whispers erupted. The board members frowned. The president smirked wider. "You have no proof, you have no power," he said dismissively. But the man opened the folder slowly, pulling out the fresh deed, the paper. Crisp, the ink dark, the county seal shining boldly at the bottom. He laid it flat on the table, his hand pressing it down, his eyes never leaving the president. "This is the deed," he said firmly. "To the strip of land where your precious fence and gate stand. As of last week, it belongs to me, not you, not this board, me." The room gasped, voices rising instantly, neighbors standing, some clapping, some shouting. The board members leaned forward in shock, their faces pale. The president's smirk collapsed, his lips parting in disbelief. He grabbed the paper, scanning it quickly, his eyes wide, his hand trembling, the seal undeniable, the truth undeniable. This is impossible." He stammered, his voice breaking. The man leaned closer, his voice low but cutting. "No, this is the law. The land is mine. The gate you built so proudly. The fence you bragged about. It all stands on ground I now own." The room erupted again, neighbors cheering loudly, others laughing bitterly at the president's stunned face. The guards at the back looked uncertain. their authority suddenly meaningless. The president slammed the paper back on the table, his voice rising. This means nothing, the HOA controls access, our rules stand. But his words were drowned by the sound of applause and shouts. The man raised his hand for silence, his voice strong as he declared, "Your rules end where my property begins, and now your gate belongs to me. From this day forward I decide who passes, not you." The neighbors roared, clapping, stomping their feet. The board sat frozen, their power stripped in an instant. The president's face red, his eyes darting, his mouth trembling as he tried to find words but none came. The man turned and walked back toward his seat slowly, the folder under his arm once again, the room buzzing with energy. The showdown had ended, and the board that once ruled with arrogance now sat in shock, their pride shattered by a single sheet of paper. And the man knew this was only the beginning, because now the balance of power had shifted, and it was his turn to decide how the game would be played. The days after the public showdown were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The HOA board, once loud and commanding, now sat in silence during meetings, their voices shaky, their eyes downcast. The president who once smirked and mocked now walked with his jaw tight, his smile gone, his power bleeding away like sand slipping through fingers. The neighbors felt the change too, where fear once kept them quiet. Now courage began to grow. People whispered less and spoke more openly. Laughter returned to porches. Conversations shifted from fear of fines to excitement about what was coming next. And in the center of it all was the man, no longer locked out, no longer ignored. He now carried himself with a calm authority that no one could deny. The guards who once blocked him at the fence now hesitated when they saw him, their eyes lowering, their shoulders stiff, unsure whether they still served the board or if their presence even meant anything at all. One morning the man walked down to the gate with slow, steady steps, his boots crunching on gravel, the neighbors following quietly behind, curious, expectant. The guards stepped forward as they always had. But this time the man raised the deed high, his voice calm but sharp. "This land is mine, the gate stands on my soil. From this moment, you no longer answer to them, you answer to me." His words cut through the crisp morning air. The guards looked at each other nervously, their hands twitching at their sides. The president appeared moments later, his face red, his voice trembling as he shouted, "Ignore him, his bluffing, the HOA rules stand." But the guards didn't move, their eyes shifting uneasily between the man with the deed and the president whose authority was crumbling. The crowd of neighbors murmured, their voices louder than before, "He owns it, it's his now." One woman said, "They can't do anything anymore." Another added, the pressure grew until the guards finally stepped back, their shoulders slumping, their silence an admission of defeat. The man stepped closer to the gate, his hand brushing the cold metal, his heart heavy with the memory of the day he first found himself locked out. The humiliation, the anger, the helplessness, and now the reversal was complete. He pulled out a new key, his own key, slid it into the lock, and turned it slowly. The heavy click echoed like thunder. The gate creaked open, wide and free, and the neighbors erupted in cheers, clapping, shouting, their voices filling the air with triumph. The president stumbled forward, his words desperate. "You can't do this. You can't just take control. The lake is ours to manage." But his voice was drowned by the sound of celebration, his authority shattered beyond repair. The man looked at him calmly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You took what wasn't yours. You locked me out of my own land. You mocked me. When I showed the truth, now the gate you built stands under my control, and you have nothing left." The president's face twisted, his hands trembling as he realized he had no power to stop what had already been set in stone. The neighbors stepped closer to the man, some patting his shoulder, others shaking his hand, their gratitude clear, their relief overwhelming. For so long they had lived under the shadow of the HOA, fined, threatened, silenced. But now they saw hope, real hope. The power had shifted. The board was no longer the untouchable authority. The balance was broken. The man stood tall, the lake shimmering behind the open gate, no longer hidden, no longer stolen. He whispered under his breath as he looked at the water, "Home again." And the words carried through the crowd like a promise, because now everyone knew the rules had changed, and the HOA would never hold the same power again. The neighborhood was never the same after the gate swung open under the man's key. The sound of that heavy lock clicking for the first time in his hand spread like wildfire through the community. Families who had once whispered in fear now spoke boldly. Laughter echoed across yards. Children ran again toward the lake, their voices light with excitement. The water shimmered free, no longer hidden behind the fence of greed. But for the HOA board, the days grew darker. Their meetings once filled with pride now became rooms of silence. Papers sat untouched. The president stared blankly at his notes, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to speak. But his words carried no weight anymore. Neighbors no longer bowed their heads when he spoke. Instead they questioned him, challenged him, even mocked him under their breath. The guards who once stood tall at the gate stopped showing up, their pay uncertain, their orders meaningless, one by one. The signs of authority the HOA clung to slipped away, fines went unpaid, rules ignored, and the power they had built with threats collapsed like sand in the tide. The president walked the streets now with his head lowered. His neighbors who once feared him now turned their backs or shook their heads at him. Some openly laughed. Others simply ignored him as if he were nothing more than a ghost of arrogance past. The man watched all this quietly from his porch. His eyes steady, his heart calmer than it had been in weeks. He saw the president once, standing by the fence that was no longer his, staring at the gate with empty eyes, his lips moving as though whispering regrets no one would ever hear. When their eyes met, the president looked away quickly, shame heavy on his shoulders. The board tried one last desperate move, sending letters filled with threats, claiming violations, demanding payment. But the man only smiled as he dropped the letters into the fire pit one by one. The flames devouring the empty threats, the neighbors cheered him, some even bringing their own old HOA fines and letters, tossing them into the fire in a quiet celebration of freedom. The board stopped sending letters after that. Their silence louder than any words. The regret was clear now, not only in the president's eyes but in the board members who avoided crowds, who walked fast with their shoulders hunched, no longer bold, no longer feared. They had lost everything the moment they underestimated the man. The moment they thought they could cage him out of his own land. They had mocked him, humiliated him, turned neighbors against each other, and now it was they who stood humiliated, powerless, broken in front of the very community they once controlled. The man didn't gloat. He didn't shout his victory in their faces. He simply lived free, his lake open, his land respected, and that silence hurt them more than any words ever could. For in that silence they saw their failure every day. In that silence they carried their regret like a chain around their necks. The fence still stood, but no longer as a symbol of their power. It now stood as a monument to their downfall, a reminder of the day they tried to take what wasn't theirs and lost everything in return. The man stood by the lake one evening, the water calm, the sky glowing with sunset, neighbors beside him, children laughing, the air filled with peace again. He whispered to himself, "They regret it now." And he knew those words would remain true, because the HOA would never forget the day they locked him out and ended up locking themselves into shame. The weeks passed, and the story of the man and his lake spread far beyond the quiet neighborhood. People from nearby towns came to see the place where one man had stood against an HOA and won. They walked past the gate, touching the bars that once locked him out, shaking their heads in disbelief at how arrogance had been defeated by patience and truth. The man never asked for fame. He never wanted to be a hero, but his actions made him one. To his neighbors, to the children who now laughed freely by the water, to the families who no longer feared fines for simply enjoying the lake. The air around the community shifted, lighter, freer, stronger. The HOA board, once proud and untouchable, had shrunk into the shadows. The president no longer spoke in meetings, and fewer people even bothered to attend. Their power was gone, their rules forgotten, and their silence was proof of their defeat. The man continued his life as before, fishing poles resting on the dock, mornings spent watching the mist rise over the water, evenings spent walking along the shoreline as the sun sank low. But he carried himself differently now, his steps firmer, his chest stronger, his eyes sharper, because he had faced them and taken back what was his. One afternoon as he stood by the lake, a small boy approached him shyly, holding a fishing line in his hand. "Can I fish here, sir?" The boy asked softly, his eyes wide with hope. The man knelt down, smiling gently. "Of course. This lake is for everyone. No one can take it from us." Again, his words were simple but they carried weight. Neighbors nearby nodded, their faces filled with gratitude. The boy smiled brightly and ran to the water's edge, casting his line with excitement. The man's heart warmed. This was the victory he wanted, not just to reclaim his right but to give back the freedom that had been stolen from everyone. That evening, as the last rays of sun touched the surface of the water, he sat quietly on the dock, his reflection rippling in the lake he had fought so hard to protect. He thought of the day he had first seen the fence, the humiliation, the anger, the fire it had sparked. He thought of the long nights digging through records, the secret purchase, the public showdown, the cheers of his neighbors, and the silence of the defeated board. It all felt like a journey written in steel and stone. And now it had ended where it began, at the water's edge, free, his voice low, he whispered into the evening air. "No one can ever lock me out again." The words carried across the calm lake, a promise not just to himself but to every soul who had watched the fight unfold. The gate still stood, but now its key rested in his pocket. Not as a chain but as a symbol of his triumph. The man leaned back, the sound of children laughing and neighbors talking in the background. The lake shimmering under the stars beginning to appear. The battle was over, the victory complete. And the HOA that once thought they ruled everything would forever remember. The man they had mocked, the man they had locked out, the man who turned their fence into his final victory.